Everyone applauded as Paddington took his place on the rug in front of the fireplace and consulted Mr. Gruber's book of party games. There was one chapter in particular that he'd had his eye on. It was called 100 Different Ways of Tearing Paper, and he was looking forward to trying some of them out. "I like paper tearing tricks," said Mr. Curry, when Paddington explained what he was going to do. "I hope they're good ones, Bear." "I think the first one is, Mr. Curry," replied Paddington. "It's called The Mystery of the Disappearing 10-pound Note." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown nervously. "Must it be a 10-pound note? Couldn't you use something else?" Paddington peered at his book again. "It doesn't say you can," he replied doubtfully, "but I expect I could make do with a 5-pound one." "I'm afraid I've left my wallet in my other jacket," said Mr. Brown hastily. "And I've only got silver," said Mr. Gruber, taking the hint as all Paddington's other friends from the market hurriedly buttoned their jackets. Everyone turned and looked towards Mr. Curry. "You did say you liked paper tearing tricks," said Mr. Brown meaningly. "And it is Paddington's party." Mr. Curry took a deep breath as he withdrew his purse from an inside pocket and undid the clasp. "I hope you know what you're doing, Bear," he growled, handing Paddington a 5-pound note. "Crikey, so do I!" whispered Jonathan as Paddington took the note and, after consulting his book once more, folded it in half and began tearing pieces out. The Browns watched anxiously while Paddington folded the note yet again, and Mr. Curry's face got blacker and blacker at the sight of all the pieces fluttering to the floor. After a slight pause, Paddington took another look at his book, and as he did so, his expression changed. Whereas a moment before he had seemed full of confidence, now his whiskers drooped and a worried look came over his face. "What are you doing now, Bear?" growled Mr. Curry as Paddington hurried over and began peering in his ear. "I'm afraid something's gone wrong with my trick, Mr. Curry," said Paddington unhappily. "What?" bellowed Mr. Curry, jumping to his feet. "What do you mean? Something's gone wrong with it?" "The note's supposed to turn up in your ear," explained Paddington, looking more and more unhappy. "Perhaps it's in the other one, dear," said Mrs. Brown hopefully. "I don't think so," replied Paddington. "I think I must have turned over 2 pages at once in my instructions. I've been doing the paper doily trick by mistake." "The paper doily trick," repeated Mr. Curry bitterly as Paddington unfolded the remains of his note and held it up for everyone to see. "My 5-pound note turned into a bear's doily." "Never mind," said Mrs. Bird, bending down to pick up the pieces. "If you stick them together, perhaps they'll change it at the bank." "It looks very pretty," said Judy. Mr. Curry snorted several times as he helped himself to a cake. "I've had enough of that bear's paper-tearing tricks for one day," he exclaimed. Mr. Gruber gave a slight cough. "Perhaps you could try one of the other chapters, Mr. Brown," he said. "I believe there's a very good one at the end of the book." "Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington gratefully. Mr. Curry wasn't the only one who was tired of paper-tearing tricks. Tearing paper, especially banknotes when they were folded, was much more difficult than it sounded, and his paws were beginning to ache. "There's a very good trick here," he announced after a short pause. "It's called removing a guest's waistcoat without taking off his coat." "It sounds rather a long trick," said Mrs. Brown doubtfully. "Isn't there anything shorter?" "Nonsense," said Mr. Curry from behind a plate of sandwiches. "It's a very good trick. I saw it done once years ago in the theater. I'd like to see it again." Mr. Brown and Mr. Gruber exchanged glances. "I'm afraid it'll have to be your waistcoat, then," said Mr. Brown. "You're the only person who's wearing one." Mr. Curry's jaws dropped. "What?" he exclaimed. "If you think that bear's going to remove my waistcoat, you're—" Whatever else Mr. Curry had been about to say was drowned in a roar of protests from the others. "You said you wanted to see it again," called out the man from the cut-price grocers. "Now's your chance." With very bad grace, Mr. Curry got up from his chair and knelt on the rug in front of the fireplace with his arms raised, while Paddington put his paws down behind his neck. "I thought you said you were going to remove my waistcoat, Bear," he gurgled. "Not choke me with it." "Well, it's half off anyway," said Mr. Brown, as Paddington pulled the waistcoat over Mr. Curry's head until it rested under his chin. "What happens now?" Paddington put his paw up one of Mr. Curry's sleeves and began searching. "I'm not quite sure, Mr. Brown," he gasped. I haven't practiced this trick before, and I can't see the book from where I am." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown, as there came a loud tearing noise, and Paddington pulled something out of Mr. Curry's sleeve. "That looks like a piece of lining." "What?" bellowed Mr. Curry, struggling to see what was going on. "Did you say lining?" Mr. Brown picked up the book of party games and adjusted his glasses. "Perhaps I'd better give you a hand, Paddington," he said. After a moment, he put the book down again and knelt on the rug. "You're quite right," he said, feeling up Mr. Curry's sleeve. "It definitely says you should pull the end of the waistcoat down the sleeve, but it doesn't say how you do it. It's very odd." Mr. Gruber joined the others on the rug. "Perhaps if we work backwards it might help," he suggested. "I think you ought to do something quickly," said Mrs. Brown anxiously as Mr. Curry gave another loud gurgle. Mr. Gruber studied Paddington's book carefully. "Oh dear," he exclaimed. "I hate to tell you this, Mr. Brown, but one of the pages appears to be missing." Mr. Curry's eyes bulged, and he gave a loud spluttering noise as he took in Mr. Gruber's words. "What's that?" he bellowed, jumping to his feet. "I've never heard of such a thing.